The Arizona sun was a merciless thing that year, hard and unblinking like a god that had grown tired of mercy. It baked the land until it cracked, burned the cactus needles brittle, and turned the wind into something dry enough to cut the throat. In that wide, empty land, on a ranch half forgotten by the maps, lived Clara Whitmore, a woman the desert had not yet beaten, though it had surely tried. Her ranch sat 5 miles south of Bisby, a scatter of weather-worn boards and stubborn life surrounded by pale hills and red sand. The house leaned a little, the barn sagged more, but both still stood, because Clara refused to let them fall. Every morning before dawn, she rose with her oldest boy, Tom, barely 12, to milk the cow, check the fences, and start the day's fight to keep the family fed. The younger ones, Ruth, Sam, and the twins, Ella and John, still rubbed sleep from their eyes when the first light touched the windows. 3 years had passed since Henry Whitmore died. Fever took him in late spring, one of those sudden desert sicknesses that came like a storm, all heat, shivering, and silence. Clara buried him by the cottonwood near the river bend. The children had wept. She hadn't. Her tears dried that same week the well nearly went empty. There hadn't been time for grief. Now she carried his work and her own, as though she could will the ranch alive through sheer stubbornness. She rode fence lines alone, patched roofs, drove cattle to water, and bartered for grain with the few coins she managed to scrape together. Her hands were blistered and brown, her shoulders strong from years of lifting more than any woman should have to. The folks in Bisby knew her name. They called her the Whitmore Widow, with a mix of pity and admiration. When she rode into town once every week or two, men tipped their hats respectfully, though not one ever walked her home. Some said she was too proud to remarry, too used to her own company. Others whispered that no man wanted a woman with 5 children trailing behind her. Clara never argued either way. Pride and pain made the same expression on her face, a hard, calm silence. That afternoon the sky shimmered with heat. She'd ridden to town for supplies: flour, beans, a coil of rope, and medicine for the twins' cough. The general store smelled of dust and molasses. Old man Haskins stood behind the counter, half blind and slower every year, but kind enough. "Hot one today, Miss Whitmore," he said as he wrapped her sack of beans. "Hot enough to cook supper without a fire," she replied dryly, earning a small laugh. While she waited, a group of miners sat near the door, talking loud, whiskey still thick on their breath from last night. Their words carried easily in the quiet store. "Apache's been sighted up near Dragoon Mountain," one said. "Saw smoke 2 nights ago." Another spat tobacco. "Probably just strays. Government's got most of them penned on the reservation, but you can't trust those devils." Clara kept her eyes on the shelves, pretending not to listen, but her chest tightened. The word Apache had a way of stirring fear deep as instinct. Years of raids and rumors made sure of that. "Course," the first miner added, "if they do come down this way, they'll find that widow's ranch first. Ain't nothing out there but her and them young ones." The others laughed, not cruelly but carelessly, the laughter of men who didn't think their words cut. Clara gathered her parcels and walked past them, chin high, jaw tight. Outside, the air shimmered like glass. She tied her goods to the saddle and swung up, the old mare shifting under her weight. She was just about to ride off when she noticed him, standing by the water trough filling a canteen. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, his hair tied back with a strip of leather. His clothes were buckskin and worn thin, his boots dusty from miles of travel. His face was calm, almost solemn, but his eyes, dark and steady, caught hers like a hawk's shadow crossing sunlight, an Apache, no doubt. Every instinct told her to look away, to ride off. But she didn't. Something in his expression wasn't wild or threatening. It was weary, patient. He nodded once, a silent greeting. She hesitated, then nodded back before turning her horse toward the long, lonely trail home. That night, after the chores were done and the children slept, she sat by the window watching the horizon fade. The desert at night had its own kind of music, the whisper of wind, the far-off cry of a coyote, the creak of wood settling. Yet tonight another sound filled her thoughts, that wordless moment at the water trough, the dark-eyed stranger's nod. It unsettled her how much she remembered it. Days passed. The sky stayed cloudless, the earth thirstier. Her fences kept breaking, coyotes, stray cattle, maybe worse. One morning she found hoofprints near the creek, not from her herd. The tracks were old but deep, made by someone heavy and sure-footed. She loaded her rifle, more out of habit than fear, and rode the southern line of her land. There she found the fence split again, wire slack, posts leaning. She dismounted, muttering under her breath, and began to fix it. Sweat stung her eyes, the sun pressing down hard as judgment. Then a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Clara spun, rifle raised. The man from town stood 10 yards away, one hand lifted in peace. "No harm," he said, his English rough but clear. "Fence broken." "I fix," her heart pounded. "This is my land," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. He nodded once. "I know. I help." There was no weapon in his hands, only a coil of wire and a calm she couldn't quite name. She lowered the rifle a little. "I don't need help," she said, though she knew she did. He gave the faintest smile. "Fence say different." Something in his tone, simple, truthful, broke her resistance. She exhaled and stepped aside. Together they worked in silence, his hands strong and sure, her curiosity warring with caution. When the last post stood straight again, he tied off the wire and stepped back. "Good fence," he said. "No more coyote." "Thank you," she managed. He nodded again, slung the empty wire roll over his shoulder, and started to walk toward the ridge. "Wait," she called. "Who are you?" He paused, then said simply, "Taza." And with that, he disappeared over the rise, leaving her staring after him, unsure if what she felt was fear, gratitude, or something else entirely. That night the wind came cold and restless. Clara tucked the children in, banked the fire, and sat again by the window. Her eyes wandered to the darkness beyond the yard, to the ridge where she'd seen him vanish. She told herself it didn't matter, that he was gone, just a wanderer passing through. But when she closed her eyes, she saw that calm face again. Those eyes that had looked at her without judgment or pity. Eyes that had seen her not as the Whitmore widow, but simply as a woman. And for the first time in years, she let herself imagine a feeling she'd long buried. Not love, not yet, but the faint, dangerous beginning of hope. Outside, the coyotes sang. Inside, Clara Whitmore whispered a silent prayer, not for safety, but for something she couldn't yet name. The next morning broke cool and pale, a mercy after so many weeks of burning heat. A light wind carried the smell of creosote and dust through the valley. Clara stood on the porch with her coffee cup, watching the horizon glow gold behind the jagged peaks. The children were still asleep inside. Only the sound of the windmill creaking and a restless horse in the corral kept her company. Her mind went back to yesterday, to the Apache called Taza who had helped mend her fence and walked away without asking for anything. It wasn't often a stranger offered work for no pay, especially one from a people most settlers still feared. The image of his steady hands, his calm voice, stayed with her. It wasn't something she wanted to admit, not even to herself. By midday, the sun had grown harsh again. Clara hitched up the wagon and drove into the east pasture to haul back fallen mesquite branches for firewood. She'd just climbed down to lift a heavy log when she heard a voice behind her. "You dropped that, hurt your back," the voice said. She turned sharply, her heart jumping. It was him, Taza, standing a few paces away, the same calm look on his face, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. "You again," she said, trying to hide her surprise. "Fence broke again," he said simply. "North side this time." "I fix." Clara set the log down and brushed her hands on her skirt. "Do you always wander around fixing other people's fences?" Taza shrugged. "Fence keep cattle safe. Cattle feed children." "Good thing." His logic was plain as stone. She couldn't argue it. "Suit yourself," she said, turning back to her work. But she couldn't help glancing at him now and then as he moved. His motions were sure and efficient, like a man who understood the rhythm of work. He pulled wire tight, set posts straight, and hammered staples without wasting a single swing. There was no hurry in him, only steady strength. By the time the afternoon light slanted orange, the north fence stood firm again. Clara came over, wiping sweat from her forehead. "That's good work," she admitted. "I ought to pay you." Taza shook his head. "No pay, you give water. That's enough," she frowned, confused. "Water?" He nodded toward the well. "Long walk from mountains. I work, then drink." "Fair trade." Clara hesitated, then gestured toward the porch. "There's a pitcher inside." You can rest a bit." He followed her slowly, careful to keep distance as though afraid to break some unspoken rule. When he sat on the steps, she handed him a tin cup filled with cold well water. He drank without waste, every swallow deliberate, then nodded in quiet thanks. The twins, Ella and John, peeked through the doorway, eyes wide. They had never seen an Apache this close. Taza smiled at them, gentle, shy. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small wooden carving of a bird, smoothed by hand. He offered it to the girl. "For you," he said softly. Ella looked up at her mother. Clara nodded once, and the girl took it. Her face lit up with wonder. Taza rose. "I go now." "You could stay for supper," Clara said before she meant to. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "There's stew," she added, clearing her throat. "And we've got plenty." He inclined his head. "If you wish." That evening, for the first time in years, the Whitmore table felt alive. The children stared at their guest with curiosity, whispering between spoonfuls of rabbit stew. Taza spoke little, but when he did, it was with a quiet certainty that silenced the room. Tom, the oldest, asked about the mountains. "They big," Taza said. "Blue in morning, red at night. My people call them sleeping giants. We learn stories from them." "What kind of stories?" Ruth asked. He smiled faintly. "Stories of wind and fire, of how the land listens when you are kind." The children leaned closer. Clara watched, amazed at how easily they trusted him. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen them so still, so eager. After supper, she stepped outside with him to see him off. The stars were coming out, sharp and cold above the dark ridge. "You talk well with children," she said quietly. He nodded. "Children are honest. They see truth, not color." Clara didn't know what to say. She felt something warm and uneasy stir in her chest. Taza turned to her. "Your husband, he was good man?" She stiffened. "He was," he nodded once. "I see, you still wear ring. That mean you keep him?" "I keep his memory," she said. "But memory doesn't mend fences or feed children." He looked at her then with an understanding that startled her. "You strong woman," he said softly. "Heart like mountain. Wind blow hard, but you still stand." No man had spoken to her like that since Henry died. For a moment she couldn't speak. She only nodded, feeling her throat tighten. When he walked away into the night, she watched until he was gone, the shadow swallowing him whole. Over the next weeks, Taza became part of the land around her ranch, appearing quietly whenever there was work to be done. He helped Tom repair the barn roof, taught the boy to track deer and read the direction of wind by the way grass leaned. He showed Ruth how to weave dry yucca into rope, and even coaxed a laugh from the twins by whistling bird calls that echoed off the canyon walls. Clara found herself waiting for him more than she admitted. His presence changed the air somehow, less heavy, less lonely. He never crossed the line between kindness and familiarity, yet his eyes always seemed to see her, not as a weary widow but as someone still capable of laughter and life. When a dust storm rolled down from the north one afternoon, sudden and wild, Taza was there again. The sky turned bronze, wind howling, sand biting at the skin. Clara barely had time to pull the children into the house before the storm hit. The world outside vanished in a blur of grit and noise. Taza threw his coat over the smallest child and stood by the door, shielding the cracks with his body as the wind shrieked through the seams. The storm raged for an hour, shaking the house, rattling the shutters. When it finally passed, a strange silence fell, the kind that hums after chaos. The children cheered weakly. Taza laughed, a deep, warm sound that filled the small room. Clara looked at him then and realized she was smiling too, her face streaked with dust and tears. "You laugh," he said, amused. "I suppose I do," she answered. "I'd forgotten what it felt like." He tilted his head. "Then storm bring good thing." She couldn't help it. She laughed again. The days that followed carried something new, a gentleness she hadn't known in years. Taza fixed what needed fixing, hunted when meat ran low, and taught the boys to ride with quiet confidence. At night, the children asked her to tell stories about the Apache man before bed, as though he were a hero from some desert legend. Yet Clara knew the world outside her ranch wouldn't see him that way. She'd heard the whispers in town already, people talking about how the widow's gotten herself an Indian hand. Some voices were mocking, others cruel. She ignored them, but they stayed in her mind like burrs under a saddle. Still, each morning she found herself hoping he would come. Each night she caught herself looking toward the ridge where he disappeared, She didn't know what this thing between them was. Friendship, need, or something she was too scared to name. But she knew one truth. Her heart was waking again, slow and tender, like spring after a long, cold season. And for the first time since Henry's death, Clara Whitmore dared to believe that the world might still hold beauty for her. That maybe, just maybe, love could grow even here, in the harsh red dust of Arizona, under a sky too wide for loneliness to last forever. The sun rose over the San Pedro Valley like molten gold, spilling light across the worn rooftops of Bisby and the parched ridges beyond. On most mornings, Clara Whitmore would have felt some comfort in the start of another day, another chance to keep her family alive, another quiet battle won against the land. But lately, every dawn carried with it a nervous twist in her chest. It wasn't fear of storms or sickness this time. It was of people, the kind of people who talked too loud and judged too easy. For weeks now, Taza had been working around her ranch. He came and went like the wind, silent, reliable, respectful. The children adored him. Even little Ella, shy as a quail, laughed freely when he showed her how to whistle through a reed of grass. To Clara, Taza was no longer just a wandering Apache. He was a presence, steady as the hills, quiet as prayer. When he worked beside her, the world didn't feel so heavy. He didn't talk much, but when he did, every word felt honest. And that honesty had slowly become something she relied on more than she meant to. Still, Bisby was small, and small towns bred small minds. It began with the preacher's wife. Clara had ridden into town for salt and flour, her youngest two tucked in the wagon. The moment she stepped into the mercantile, the chatter hushed. Mrs. Brown, the preacher's wife, smiled with that brittle kind of politeness that carried judgment like perfume. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "We were just talking about you." "I figured," Clara said coolly. Mrs. Brown's smile didn't falter. "Word is you've taken on an Indian hand. From the reservation, I presume?" Clara set her flour on the counter. "From nowhere but the good Lord's earth, far as I can tell. He works honest and asks nothing in return." The other women exchanged looks. One murmured something about setting examples. Another whispered, "Poor children." Clara's patience snapped. "He saved this ranch more times than any man in town." That's more example than gossip ever set. She paid her coin, gathered her things, and walked out before the silence could cut deeper. As she drove back toward the ranch, her hands shook on the reins. She wasn't ashamed, she refused to be, but anger burned hot under her ribs. The world could forgive a widow for surviving, but not for being happy again. That evening, when Taza came by with a bundle of mesquite wood for the stove, she was still fuming. He noticed at once. "Something wrong?" She shook her head. "Nothing worth talking about." He studied her for a moment. "People talk?" Her eyes snapped to his. "How'd you know?" His expression didn't change. "Always same story. White men talk, my people listen. Words sharp like arrows." Clara sighed, shoulders sagging. "They think you shouldn't be here." He was silent for a long time. "Then you think same?" The question landed like a blow. "No, I think you've done more good than any man I've met since Henry passed." "And that's the truth." Taza's eyes softened. Then no matter. She wished it were that simple. But she knew the town. The sheriff wouldn't stay quiet for long. Sure enough, trouble came riding up the next afternoon. The sound of hooves echoed through the valley, heavy, deliberate. Clara stepped out of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw Sheriff Cole dismounting by the fence. He was a tall man with sunburned skin and the weary look of someone who'd seen too much bad and not enough good. "Morning, Clara," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Need a word with your helper." Taza stepped out from behind the corral, calm as ever. "I work, you talk here." The sheriff squinted. "I've had complaints. Folks don't like an Apache staying on a white woman's land. It's riling people up. You understand that, don't you?" Taza met his gaze without flinching. "I hurt no one. I fix fence, care for land. You want me gone because people talk?" The sheriff hesitated. "Ain't that I want it. But it'd make things easier for everyone." Clara stepped forward. "Easier for who, Sheriff?" "Certainly not me. He's done more for this ranch than anyone since Henry died." "Clara," the sheriff said quietly, "you know I respect you, but you're making life harder for yourself and your young ones." Her jaw tightened. "I've done hard all my life. I'll manage." The sheriff sighed, touched his hat, and rode off. Dust rose behind him like a warning. Taza turned to her. I bring you trouble. Clara's throat tightened. You bring me peace. That night, the air between them felt different, full of words neither dared say. The children had gone to bed early, the lamps dimmed low. Outside, the coyotes sang to the moon. Clara sat by the fire, darning socks with slow, careful stitches. Taza sat near the door, sharpening a broken hoe handle into something useful. The scrape of the knife filled the quiet. Finally, Clara set the socks down. You don't have to stay, you know. I'd understand. He looked up. You want me gone? No, she said too quickly. But I don't want to make your life harder. He smiled faintly. Hard life makes strong heart. I'm not afraid. She met his eyes. I am. Taza set the knife aside and rose, slow and steady, until he stood before her. Why? She swallowed hard. Because I've lost before. And I don't think I could bear losing again. He studied her face, then spoke in that low, measured voice of his. You say no man wants woman with 5 children. You're wrong. Her breath caught. Good thing, he said softly, a small smile tugging at his lips. I not man like them. Good thing I need big family. For a moment, the world held still, the firelight flickering between them, her heart thudding like hooves on hard earth. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. I know, he replied. I know you strong, kind, and tired of being alone. I know children laugh again when I come. I know this house feel like home. Tears stung her eyes. No one had said the word home in years. Not like that. She reached up without thinking, her hand brushing his cheek, rough, warm, real. He didn't move closer, didn't dare. But the space between them shrank to nothing. For the first time in years, Clara felt alive. The days that followed were both sweet and tense. Taza kept his distance when he went into town for supplies. Knowing eyes followed him wherever he walked. The blacksmith refused to sell him nails. The saloon men laughed when he passed. Clara faced her share, too. Women who turned away, men who shook their heads. But she held her chin high the same way she had since the day she buried her husband. Love had come to her in the unlikeliest of ways. Not soft or easy, but fierce and true like a desert flower blooming through stone. One evening, when the children were asleep, she found Taza standing outside, looking at the moon. Do you regret staying? She asked quietly. He didn't look at her. No, but I regret not coming sooner. Her breath trembled. If you stay, people will talk worse than before. He finally turned. Then let them talk. The wind carry words away. The land remember only truth, she smiled faintly. And what's the truth, Taza? He reached for her hand, holding it gently, reverently. That I love you, Clara Whitmore. You and the 5 hearts you guard. The night swallowed the rest, and the words, the fear, the long years of loneliness, and then left only silence, and the steady beat of 2 hearts daring to defy the world together. Outside, the desert wind rose again, soft and warm like a promise whispered under the endless western sky. Autumn crept into the Arizona valley slow and quiet, like an old cat stalking through tall grass. The air cooled by inches, the morning smelled faintly of mesquite smoke, and Clara Whitmore found herself almost believing the world had granted her peace. Her ranch, once half dead, now breathed again. The cattle were healthy, the fences strong, and laughter, real laughter, had returned to her porch. Taza's steady hands and calm spirit had changed everything. The children adored him. Tom followed him like a shadow, learning to track by the shape of prints and the bend of grass. Ruth gathered wild herbs he taught her to recognize, while the twins competed to make him laugh first every morning. Clara sometimes caught herself standing still, watching him work beneath the sun. It was strange how quickly she had grown used to him. His quietness, his sure movements, the way he always paused to listen to the wind before speaking, as if it whispered counsel only he could hear. He was part of the rhythm of the ranch now, as necessary as water or shade, but peace on the frontier was a fragile thing, and the desert had its own way of testing hearts. The morning it happened began like any other. A dry wind blew in from the hills, carrying the smell of dust and sage. Clara hung laundry while the children chased each other through the corral. Taza was repairing the barn door hinges when thunder rumbled far off toward the mountains. Storm coming, he said, glancing at the sky. Clara looked up. Looks dry to me. Taza shook his head. Dry thunder bring fire. We watch. By late afternoon, the clouds had gathered thick and heavy, the kind that glowed purple in the setting sun. Lightning cracked across the sky, jagged and blinding. The air hummed with static. The children squealed, half frightened, half thrilled. Then, from the ridge beyond the creek, came the dull, unmistakable roar of something burning. Taza froze, nostrils flaring. "Fire," he said, already running toward the barn. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. Dear God. A moment later, smoke curled above the corral. A lightning strike had hit the dry haystack near the barn. The flames were small at first, but the wind took them like a bellows. Within minutes, fire crawled up the wooden wall, feeding hungrily. "Tom, get the twins inside," Clara shouted. "Ruth, fetch water from the trough." Taza grabbed a shovel and began beating at the flames, but the heat was merciless. Sparks leapt high into the air, carried by the wind toward the roof. The dry boards caught instantly. "Back!" Clara cried. "It's too strong." Then a scream sliced through the chaos. "Mama!" Clara spun. Ruth stood near the doorway, eyes wide with horror. "Ella and John, they ran inside to save their puppy." The words hit Clara like a bullet. Her heart stopped. The barn was blazing, the doorway a wall of orange. She moved before she could think, but Taza caught her arm. "No," he said firmly. "You stay. Those are my babies." She cried, struggling against him. He looked at her, steady, unshakable, and said, "I bring them." Before she could protest, he wrapped his face in his bandana, lowered his head, and charged into the smoke. "Taza," she screamed, but the fire swallowed his name. The minutes that followed stretched into forever. The roar of the flames drowned out everything, the crack of wood, the hiss of collapsing beams, the frightened cries of animals in the corral. Clara stood helpless, tears streaking her soot-covered cheeks, praying aloud, begging, promising anything to heaven if it would bring them back. Then, through the smoke, a shape moved, bent, coughing, carrying two small bodies wrapped in his arms. "Taza," she gasped. He stumbled out, clothes burning at the edges, eyes red from smoke. Clara ran to him, grabbing the children first, clutching them close. Ella coughed once, then began to cry. John blinked, dazed but alive. Taza collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His hands were blistered, his skin scorched where his coat had torn. Still, when he looked up at her, he smiled faintly. "All safe," he rasped. Clara dropped beside him, tears falling freely now. "You fool," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his. "You brave, beautiful fool." By nightfall, the barn was gone, only a blackened skeleton against the starlit sky. But the house still stood, and so did everyone inside it. The children huddled together on the floor, soot-streaked and shaken, while Clara tended to Taza's burns with trembling hands. She wrapped his palms in cool cloth soaked with aloe and water, her touch gentle as a prayer. Every time he winced, she whispered, "Hush now," though her own voice shook. "You saved them," she said softly. "You saved all of us." He looked at her, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "They my children too now." Her throat closed around the words she wanted to say. She reached for his hand instead, careful not to hurt him. Their fingers met, bandages and all, and stayed there. In the days that followed, word spread fast through Bisby. By the end of the week, everyone knew the story. The Apache who ran into a burning barn to save a white woman's children. At first there were skeptics. Then came witnesses. Tom told it in the blacksmith shop, Ruth repeated it at church, and before long even Sheriff Cole tipped his hat in quiet respect when he passed the ranch. No one spoke ill of Taza anymore. One morning, the preacher himself rode out to the Whitmore place. He found Taza splitting logs with bandaged hands, the children laughing nearby. Clara stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. "Reverend," she said cautiously. He nodded, looking humbled. "Mrs. Whitmore, word is this man saved your young ones." "That true?" "It is." The preacher looked at Taza for a long moment, then said, "Well, ma'am, if you ever wish your union blessed proper in the Lord's eyes, I'd be honored to do it." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected the offer, not so soon. She glanced toward Taza. He met her gaze, quiet and steady as ever. "We'll let you know, Reverend," she said softly. When he rode off, the children crowded around, chattering about weddings and flowers. Clara laughed through her tears. That night she and Taza stood beneath the stars, the air cool and sweet after rain. The burned barn still smelled of ash, but new boards were stacked nearby, ready to rebuild. "You should rest," she told him. He shook his head. Tomorrow we start again. Fire take wood, not spirit. She smiled, touching his bandaged hand. You talk like a man twice your age. He chuckled softly. Desert teach fast. Then he looked at her, eyes dark and serious. Clara, I almost die today. But when I carry children, I feel something, home. I not want leave again. Her eyes filled with tears. You're not leaving, Taza, not now. Not ever. He nodded once, simple and sure. The moonlight spilled across their faces, painting them silver. Around them, the desert stretched vast and silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Alive with the promise of something new rising from ashes. By the next week, the townsfolk began bringing help. The blacksmith donated lumber. The sheriff sent his deputy to lend a hand. Even Mrs. Brown, the preacher's wife, arrived with a basket of bread and a look of awkward shame. Clara watched Taza work among them, laughing with Tom, instructing the men who came to help. His presence, once whispered about, now commanded quiet respect. When the new barn was raised, the children hung wildflowers from the rafters. Taza lifted Ella to the beam so she could tie the last ribbon herself. Clara stood back, her heart swelling. She realized then that the fire hadn't just burned her barn. It had burned away the last of her fear. That night, after everyone had gone, she and Taza sat together on the porch. The horizon glowed faintly red from the setting sun. You ever think you'd find a place like this again? She asked softly. He looked toward the hills. Place maybe. Family, no. She turned to him. You've got one now. He smiled, slow and true. Yes, big family. Clara laughed, the sound warm and full. Good thing then, that's what you needed. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. Their fingers laced together as the crickets began to sing and the desert night settled around them like a gentle blanket. For the first time in a long time, Clara Whitmore felt no emptiness, no fear, only the deep, quiet certainty that love, like the land, could endure anything if you just held on long enough. The sun rose gold and slow over the Arizona hills, washing the land in color so pure it made Clara Whitmore's breath catch. It had been 6 months since the fire, 6 months since the night everything changed. The ranch had healed, stronger than before, its fences mended and its people bound by something deeper than blood. And in that time, something else had quietly taken root. Love that had begun as gratitude, deepened through shared labor, and blossomed like desert flowers after rain. The mornings always started the same now. Clara would wake before dawn to the soft cooing of doves outside her window, the air cool and still. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and she'd find Taza there already, always up first, grinding beans with one good hand while the other, still scarred from the fire, rested loosely on the table. He'd glance at her with that half-smile of his, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. Morning comes fast in this land, he'd say. And never too soon, she'd answer. Every day the same way, they didn't need fancy speeches. They'd lived too much for that. Their love was quiet, built on trust and small gestures. A repaired hinge, a shared meal, a child's laughter in the yard. The town had changed toward them too. Where once there had been whispers and stares, there were now nods, smiles, even invitations. Folks finally saw what Clara had known for months, that Taza was no savage, no drifter, but a man of honor, the kind of man the West itself respected. When spring came, the preacher rode out again. He brought with him a leather-bound Bible, a bouquet of sage, and a gentle smile that no longer carried pity. Well, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, or should I say Miss Clara, I reckon it's time we make things proper. The town's behind you both. Even the sheriff says it's high time. Clara's heart fluttered like a startled bird. She looked toward Taza, who was standing near the corral, wiping his hands on a cloth after fixing a saddle. The children had gathered around him, laughing. He looked up, caught her gaze, and in that one look she saw it all. The trust, the patience, the waiting. She turned back to the preacher, smiling through tears. You're right, Reverend. It's time. The wedding took place a week later under a sky so blue it seemed freshly painted by the hand of God himself. The entire town came, not out of curiosity this time, but out of respect. They gathered beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. Clara wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, nothing fancy, just soft fabric and honest work. The children stood beside her, Tom tall and proud, Ruth holding flowers, the twins squirming with excitement, and little Ella clutching her new stepfather's hand as if she'd never let go again. Taza wore his finest shirt, woven by his own people, a band of red and black across the shoulders. His long hair was tied neatly behind him, and around his neck hung a small turquoise charm, the symbol of protection. When the preacher began to speak, the desert fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Clara Whitmore," he said, "do you take this man, Taza, to be your lawful husband, to walk beside you through storm and sun, hardship and harvest?" Her voice trembled, but her eyes never wavered. "I do." "And you, Taza," the preacher turned to him, "do you take this woman, Clara, and her children as your family, to love, protect, and cherish for as long as this land holds the sky?" Taza nodded once, solemn and sure. "I do, always," the preacher smiled. "Then by the grace of the Almighty and the goodwill of this town, I pronounce you man and wife." The crowd erupted in cheers, hats tossed high into the air. The children whooped with joy. Clara laughed, a bright, full sound, and Taza, never one for public displays, leaned down and kissed her gently, the kind of kiss that carried all the words neither of them had ever needed to say. After the ceremony came the feast. Long tables were set up beneath the trees, filled with pies, biscuits, roasted meat, and jugs of sweet cider. Music played, a fiddle, a harmonica, and even a drum that Taza's cousin brought from his tribe. The rhythms blended, white and Apache together, until the air itself felt alive. Tom danced with Ruth. The twins chased each other in dizzy circles, and even old Sheriff Cole laughed as he clapped along to the beat. Clara sat for a moment on the edge of it all, watching. The scene shimmered before her, a strange, beautiful union of two worlds that had once stood so far apart. And right in the center of it, smiling, stood the man who had brought them together. When Taza finally sat beside her, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "This feels like a dream," she whispered. He shook his head. "No dream. Dream fade when sunrise. This stay." She looked at him, eyes shining. "You really believe that?" He smiled faintly. "I believe in what we build with our hands. Fire cannot burn it. Wind cannot take it." She kissed his cheek softly. "Then we'll build forever." The months rolled by. The ranch thrived more than ever before. They took on new cattle, built a second barn, and planted fruit trees along the creek. Taza taught Tom to ride bareback and Ruth to track deer by the moonlight. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, the whole family would sit on the porch, the desert cooling around them. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, 1,000 tiny fires burning in the black velvet sky. Taza would tell stories in his quiet, low voice, tales of his people, of spirits in the mountains and rivers that remembered everything. The children would listen wide-eyed, and Clara would rest her hand over his, feeling the pulse of life steady beneath his skin. One evening, as the cicadas hummed and the horizon glowed faintly gold, she whispered, "Do you ever miss it? The old life, the open road, the tribe?" He thought for a long time before answering. "I miss what made me, but I have what I was meant for now." He looked toward the children laughing in the yard. "This is tribe too." "My tribe." Clara smiled, tears stinging her eyes. "And I have my warrior." The next spring brought another kind of miracle. Clara found herself standing by the creek one morning, hand resting on her belly, realizing she was carrying new life. When she told Taza, his eyes widened with astonishment. Then slowly his face broke into the kind of smile she'd only seen once before, the day he'd first called her wife. "Big family," he said quietly, pressing his palm to her stomach. "Just what I need." She laughed through tears, her voice trembling with joy. "Then I suppose we'll give it to you." By the time the baby was born, a healthy, dark-haired boy with his father's eyes, the ranch had become the heart of the valley. Folks came from miles around to see them, bringing gifts and blessings. The preacher christened the child Samuel Taza Whitmore, but the children preferred the name their father whispered over him at night, Kohana, meaning swift like the wind. As Taza held the newborn under the open sky, the stars gleaming above, he looked down at Clara, tired but radiant, and whispered, "Now it is complete." She nodded, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Yes, my love, it is." Years later, travelers passing through Bisby would hear about the Whitmore Ranch, a place where the land was kind, the people fair, and laughter was as common as sunlight. They'd say it was run by a woman with 5 children and an Apache husband who worked harder than 10 men. A man who could calm a horse with a word and heal a wound with a touch. And if those travelers ever stopped by, they'd see it for themselves in the laughter, the warmth, the love that filled every inch of that homestead under the vast desert sky. Clara would greet them at the gate, smile lines deepened by years of joy, and Taza would stand beside her, tall and quiet, his arm around her shoulders. Sometimes when the visitors left, Clara would look up at the sunset, the same gold sky that had once witnessed her loneliness, and whisper, almost to herself, "I had 5 kids and no man wanted that." Then she'd glance at Taza, who always smiled in return, the same way he had that first day. "Good thing," he'd say, his voice deep and full of warmth. "I needed a big family." And as the night spread over the desert, they'd stand together, surrounded by the laughter of children and the music of crickets, their love a quiet fire that would never burn out.